Hey guys, it's Marco. So earlier this year when I was preparing for interviews, obviously there's technical interviews and leak codes are very common, but one sort of question I didn't really hear get talked about was this OOP style of question, which I got asked at actually several places. And in this style of question, it's a lot more day-to-day like work where you're not really focusing on time complexity and the most efficient data structure, but rather implementing basic endpoints that would be a lot more similar to what you actually do in a real job. So yeah, today I've made a little example one of the type of question and how I'd go about doing it. So I've designed it in three parts, like it would be in a real interview. The first one here, make it a system that assigns up workers. Each worker should have these variables, and then implement these two methods. So yeah, when I go about this, obviously you can write this in the main function, but yeah, these interviews are all about like showing you different abstractions and stuff like that. So I recommend making a new class to separate all these functions and keep it together. Whether you support OOP or not, this is a very, I think, common way of doing things in software and what the interviewers are often looking for. So then within this, you have to implement the two methods. So I would start by always defining some data classes or structs in other languages like C++ or Python that will just keep track of your variables and make the abstractions nicer. Obviously, I'm doing this in Kotlin here, but this could be in any programming language. So yeah, let's make a data class to hold those variables. And I'd probably ask the interviewer here like, hey, should I use an enum for this? Do we know the values right now? And then they're probably like, oh no, just stick with the string for now. But yeah, we'll come back to this. So yeah, we've made our little worker class, and now let's implement the methods. So I recommend implementing the function signatures and then talking about how you'd go about actually implementing those. So here what I've done is I've said there's going to be one function register worker which takes in a worker and will register them, and this is going to return a unit. So this is the same as void or just returning nothing. You can actually remove it here, but I just added that just for clarity to say this function doesn't return anything. And then we have this get worker by name function which takes a string, and it may or may not return a worker depending on if they exist or not. So we have this question mark here for it to mean nullable, as in sometimes if you query by a name that doesn't exist, you get nothing back or null. I recommend when you're in these interviews here discussing stuff like, oh, maybe in a production environment this would return a boolean or something to return whether or not the registration was successful, but here in our application code it should never fail. Then I'd go ahead talking about how to actually implement these. So normally in a real code base, you'd be working with a database for this sort of thing. But here, when we're doing application in code, I recommend using either a map or a list to represent these. I once did a list, which I think is more common in Kotlin, and the interviewer was like, it's actually inefficient. Can you optimize this by using a map? And like, obviously, but in real production code, I would prefer lists over. Anyway, so let's just do this with a map. So what I'd do is for this register workers function, in this worker registration system, I would create a map that works as the database, where we can store a key of the worker's name to their details. And then in the register worker function, we'd add that to the map, and the get workers by name would query that from the map. So let's do that here. Cool, we've defined that here. Now let's implement the functions. Now that we've implemented this, I think it's very important to do testing. So what I've experienced, one way is that they send you a bunch of test cases for you to run manually, or they say just test it yourself. Now, at the place I worked at previously, they had a hiring bar, and they pretty much said worst doesn't meet the criteria is if they don't write any tests at all, and then meets the criteria if they do like some basic tests in the main function, and then it was like exceptional if they write unit tests. Now, personally, I think writing unit tests in an interview is dumb, but I would be prepared to do it anyway, just in case that's what's expected of you, and I guess that's more similar to what you do in production code. So here I've set up this in advance, just getting the unit testing libraries ready. I'm sure this varies based on language. These are the Java ones. But yeah, what I'd do is you want to make a test that asserts on these basic criteria. So in our case, I want to test this worker sign up that registers the workers and then gets the worker by name. Let's do that now. We create a worker here and then we register, create the registration system. Then we register that worker and then we try and query by it. And we also query the null logic to make sure that if the name doesn't exist, we return null. And let's try run it. And you can see that passes. All right, in part 2 here, this is something I saw as well. Pretty much what you would need to do is add a query endpoint that shows that you can do sorting and filtering. And oftentimes you have to use some sort of lambda functions. In Kotlin, this is very easy to do lambda functions. This would be like a custom sort. But obviously in other languages like say Python or C++, it's a little bit harder and you need to have the syntax memorized, or you'll have to Google the documentation in real time, which obviously I think it's understandable and reasonable, but it just, if you're fluent in programming and can just do it without having to look up documentation, it definitely leaves a strong impression. So I recommend getting very familiar with adding custom sorters and comparators. So let's this example here, implement an endpoint to query based on occupation and years of experience range. So let's make the function signature now. Okay, I've implemented the function signature now, and I'll just talk about how to do it. So obviously in a production level environment, it doesn't really matter as much about this efficiency here. So I wouldn't bother making some hash map to try and query this efficiently. I'll just say, let's get all the occupations, let's convert it to a list, and then filter by the occupation, and then make sure that it fits between this range. And let's just add another requirement to make it realistic. Sort this by years of experience, because yeah, as I said, oftentimes they require a sort and some sort of filter. I've done that now, and this will sort by the years of experience, starting least experienced to most experienced. And then yeah, we can implement a unit test of this as well. I kind of can't be bothered, so I'll just describe it. What I would do is I'd make a unit test where we make several workers, one with the expected occupation and one without, and then we make some workers that fall within the experience range and some that fall without, and then I'd call it and make sure that we get the expected result returned where they're in the correct order, and we only get the ones that match the filter. Yeah, let's move on to part 3. So here there's 2 different occupations, a Sparky and a software engineer. And then we have to add 2 endpoints. One, given a name, create the base salary, which will be this amount that they make here. Another to calculate the total salaries of all workers registered with the given occupation. So there's multiple ways to go about this before. So I mentioned earlier that with the occupation, right now this is a string, but you could have asked the interviewer, hey, should this be an enum? And yeah, one way of doing this is making this string an enum and then saying, okay, here's a list of the known professions, and if it's this profession, do this. If it's this profession, do this. And I think this is acceptable and works in some ways. But yeah, in these OOP style interviews, they're probably asking you to do it a bit more OOPy and make some sort of interface where these both have a function to get the base salary and get the total salary. So yeah, I recommend instead of doing this to switch to a more interface approach where you make some different you make an interface and then add some different implementations of the actual class. Now, I don't necessarily love interfaces, but you got to play the game sometimes, and this is what they want. So let's switch to that. Now that we've made the interface, let's make some implementations of it. All right, now that I made these interfaces, let's implement the 2 endpoints. So one, given a name, query the base salary of the worker. So let's add this to the interface. Let's add another function within to actually calculate the total salary. All right, cool, I've implemented that now. So you can see there's the worker class, which has a calculate salary abstract function. This is the interface, and then the 2 implementations of the class, software engineer and Sparky, override this. There's probably some optimizations here. Maybe you could use a sealed class so we know the amount of implementations at runtime. But yeah, this will get by for now. So now let's actually make the function signatures and implement the methods in the class. So I've implemented part 1. We query the worker based on the name, and if it doesn't exist, return 0. I recommend here you should ask for edge cases. So maybe say if the worker doesn't exist, what should we do? And maybe they would say return null, or maybe they'll say return 0. Or -1. Yeah, just make sure to clarify these sorts of requirements with the interviewer. Calculate the total salaries of all workers registered with given occupation. And actually, now that the occupation is embedded into the class definition, we can remove this occupation string. Bang. And then here we can compare the class. So instead of taking occupation, yep, so here we can check on the class instead, and then we can do the same here. So we'll say, so what we're going to do is we get these values again, and then just get the ones with the correct occupation, and then we can do like sum of it dot, and we name our function here. This should actually return an integer. So here we've utilized interfaces in order to get the total salaries of occupation and just having to call this calculate salary function. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Obviously you'd write a unit test for this if you have time, but that's everything. Good luck in your interviews. Yep.